Hey, good morning, everybody, or good time zone, wherever you find yourself this fine Thursday, or I guess other days if you're finding yourself around the world. Who knows what time it is wherever you are? I certainly don't, but maybe you do, and you can let me know in the comments or in the chat today. This is a Hangouts and Headlines episode, so for those of you that are more familiar with Virtual Legality, this does not go into the law or specifics as much, although there will be a short Virtual Legality kind of segment of this conversation we're about to have about video game publisher Ubisoft. Instead, Hangouts and Headlines is kind of our discussion show. We have a Hangout section to start out each episode where we talk with the community about what's going on with them, and I have some questions that I want to ask that lead into the topic we're going to discuss in Headlines. But the headlines don't happen for about a half hour from the beginning of the show. If you want to skip ahead and you're watching this on replay, hopefully I will have gotten chapters up by the time you're seeing this, and you can skip ahead to that headline to discuss Ubisoft and what the heck is going on over there. Or if you prefer the Hangouts, just stick with us right now or follow us up after we talk about the headlines, and we'll have another Hangout section then. So with that all said, thank you everybody for coming and joining us here on Hangouts and Headlines. I love talking with you all, and I will be highlighting some of your comments, letting me know where you're at, how you're doing, how the weather is, what time it is, where I can find you, and then we'll discuss some Ubisoft-related things as part of today's Hangout. So, welcome everyone, including Don Leinart. Woo, Hangouts and Headlines time. Good morning from Orlando, soon to be Charleston. I fly in a few hours. Oh, good. I was worried there that Charleston had elected to annex Orlando, which is a pretty good distance away. But if you're traveling, that makes much more sense, Don. I hope you're having a good day, and I hope this show helps kill the hours between your travel times. I know I'm not a fan of a travel day myself, so hopefully I can help entertain and maybe inform as part of your travel experience. So thank you for joining us today. Let's see what else we've got. Sardisms is struggling with data strength in Ohio. Ohio struggles with a lot of stuff, Sardisms. It's not your fault. I get it. Sorry about that, though. In all honesty, it's no fun to have tech issues or data issues, certainly for what we pay for them. So I hope that it improves. I hope that you get to see me in my glorious mug in full high definition. And if not, well, you're probably saved from all of that as well. So Sardisms, thank you for checking in with us. Totally Jersey is also in Ohio, checking in. Good morning. So glad to catch the live. Missed the last one. We missed you, Totally Jersey. And we're very happy to be doing more episodes on the channel now. We'll see how long I can keep this up. But we have been averaging about one a week on this channel and a number of appearances on other channels that I will also talk about towards the end of this video, because if you're interested in this topic or you wind up having a good time with this conversation, you can hear more from me on this very topic at a different channel, probably later on in the day, but if not later today, at least very, very soon. And I'll talk about that as part of this conversation. Emily says this works perfectly because I have a meeting in 30 minutes and I don't know what Ubisoft is. Laughing face emoji. So I'll just be here for the Hangout. That's totally fine, Emily. Not everybody knows what Ubisoft is. This is a video game publisher, and as such, kind of crosses the line between my usual Virtual Legality content and my Hangouts and Headlines content. But I thought this particular article was one that I wanted to talk about because it does a number of the things that we've discussed in this space regarding media reporting and loopholes or blind spots in the information that gets conveyed to you, even in what I would describe as a very well-written article, which I don't always get to say in Hangouts and Headlines. So we're going to talk about all of that when we get to the headlines. Hedgehog in Space says, greetings from South Carolina. Now, is that Space South Carolina, Hedgehog? Or is that South Carolina terrestrially? And then if it is terrestrially, are you really in space? I have a lot of questions about this, but I love the profile image. Always glad to see you. Waving emoji, waving to you, Hedgehog in Space. I hope you're having a great time in South Carolina. Kat McGowan says, greetings from Florida. Hi, Kat. Hope you're doing okay in Florida. I know you just got hit by a hurricane, much like some other places in Southeast America. So I hope you're doing all right. Greetings to you. Debbie W says, good morning from Seattle. Very early morning. I need coffee. The sun isn't even awake yet. I don't blame you. Yeah, I don't think I could get up at this equivalent time on the West Coast to do this show for you, even though I know Hangouts and Headlines was originally a 7:30 a.m. show. That is just not my speed right now. So thank you so much for getting up and being here with us for Hangouts and Headlines. Let's see here. Don says, pretty sure he's talking about Last Stand Media. I am. Announced its sacred symbols, but Hoeg is being cryptic, LOL. I'm not being cryptic. I just like to leave teasers for people to stay with us on the video. You know, Don? I hear that's how this thing is supposed to operate. But If I'm doing it wrong, yes. I'm talking about Last Stand Media for a video that they haven't even announced yet, let alone released either on their Patreon or publicly. So yes, I'm trying to be a little bit cryptic so as to not otherwise obligate them or feel an obligation for them to release a video before it's edited or ready, because I know how that feels and I don't want to do that to them. Hyacinth, good morning, everyone. Happy for a morning with Hangouts and Headlines. Happy to have you, Hyacinth. Tough Cookie says hi from Kentucky. Got lots of cats in the profile imagery today. Love them. Nice to see them. Nishay Jones says, hello, everyone. Hello, me and Mrs. Hoeglaw. Good thoughts appreciated, please. Yesterday, I had a biopsy done on my left breast, and I'm really hoping they find nothing to be concerned about. I'm really hoping that for you, too. Yeah, I will tell you, having been through the healthcare system a lot in the last couple of years, that I certainly have an amount of anxiety and stress related to medical testing at this point in time. And so it's totally reasonable. I hope everything turns out all right, Nishay Jones. Thank you for sharing it with us here on Hangouts and Headlines. I really do hope for it. Jello says we need a dog profile pic. Too many cat profiles. So here I am. Hello, dog profile on the beach. And now Bath Company says, Nishay Jones, good luck. Good luck, absolutely, from the whole community, from me, certainly. And with that said, let's ask a few prep questions. Because you are all so familiar with Ubisoft, what's your favorite Ubisoft title? Now, to give you a little help on this, if you aren't familiar with this publisher makes, among other things, as you might have been able to tell from the title to this video, the game series Far Cry, the game series Assassin's Creed. They recently released Star Wars Outlaws. They released an Avatar game last year that I believe was called Frontiers of Pandora, the planet in that series. They make a car racing game called The Crew. And if none of those appeal to you, they also make a game called Rayman, which is a 2D platformer that goes back a little ways. It also has Rayman 3D, which was in 3D, but I don't think as well received as their 2D games. And if you're more of a Nintendo fan, they collaborated with Nintendo to make the Mario and Rabbids Kingdom Battle series. So do any of you like any of those things? Are you familiar with this company at all? Let me know. Kat McGowan jumps in with not any of the ones I mentioned. So, it's a real fan here. Heroes of Might and Magic. Now, I also like Heroes of Might and Magic, an offshoot of the Might and Magic RPG series that, let's say, borrowed a lot of the philosophies in game design from a game that I really, really liked back in the day called King's Bounty. And so, yeah, Heroes of Might and Magic is a good pick. It's a game where you develop an army of your own out of various mythological creatures and forces in order to fight amongst each other, as one does in a war game. And if you like color, if you like music, if you like strategy, Heroes of Might and Magic is still available as a series in various places online. Highly recommend it. Very good series. Let's see here. Nishay Jones says, I like Prince of Persia and Rayman. Yeah, Prince of Persia, fantastic. Prince of Persia, The Lost Crown, which came out this year, one of my favorite games of the year. So I think a really underrated game. I think a lot of people forgot that it released this year, but it's an excellent, what the gamers call a Metroidvania, meaning that it's a kind of open world 2D exploration game with expanding environments based on the skills that you get in various places in the levels. And I really recommend it to everybody. It's a very good game. Don Leinart says Assassin's Creed is the best they make. I love Assassin's Creed. You can see the video series that I've done on this channel from time to time talking about my favorite games. Assassin's Creed Odyssey was my favorite game of the year it released because it gives you that virtual tourism. If you've ever wanted to see the Peloponnesian War or ancient Greece as it might have looked, at least through the eyes of a video game developer and blockbuster kind of video game, you can go and see those things. You can see ancient Egypt. You can see the Viking invasion of England. You can see coming up at some point feudal Japan. And that's going to be a part of our conversation today as well. I love the Assassin's Creed series. Some people don't love the kind of conversion of it into an RPG as much as others, but I love both versions of Assassin's Creed. And Ubisoft, honestly, is one of my favorite kind of most consistent publishers. The reason I think they get a lot of negativity online is because their games are very similar philosophically. They can be argued to be making essentially Ubi game, the same kind of game with different skins on top. And I think that bothers a lot of people. but I like Ubi Game, and so I wind up liking a lot of their content. See here, Cat McGowan says, I remember King's Bounty. Good. King's Bounty is awesome. King's Bounty as an intellectual property, I think, was bought by a different company. And the modern King's Bounties and King's Bounty 2 in particular are kind of separated from that older feel. But certainly the older games are top of the line and really the genesis point for Heroes of Might and Magic. Gamer Ducko says, I never really beat the original Rayman. I keep meaning to fix it. It's a good question. I'm not positive I beat the original Rayman. So I think I beat Rayman 2. That might have been my first Rayman that I finished. Shell says, my son loved Mario plus Rabbids. Mario plus Rabbids is maybe one of the best strategy series in gaming right now, which doesn't make any sense, right? It's a Ubisoft Mario crossover. It has no right to be as good as it is, but it is a fantastic game. Warhammer asking the deep questions already. Can Microsoft buy Ubisoft? Well, Microsoft has a big war chest of money. They have a big pile of money because, as you might know, they make things like Windows and enterprise software, as well as Xbox and video games. So they have a lot of money. They can do a lot with it. You've seen the challenges from various government agencies that kind of get involved in these things, as we saw when they bought Activision. I don't think Microsoft is inclined to buy Ubisoft, but certainly the declining stock price of Ubisoft, which we're going to talk about as part of this article, this headline, is something that attracts money. It attracts potential investors because they look at a pile of assets in Ubisoft, the licenses, the game developers, the organization on the whole, and say, if that's not being utilized as best as it could be, then I can buy it at a discount. I can make some changes, and I can essentially take this house that was dilapidated and broken, renovate it, and flip it in a short term, right? It's very similar to that kind of house flipping concept when we talk about acquirers and things. For Microsoft, they would be a strategic acquirer. They'd be looking to add to their Game Pass and video gaming portfolio. So the answer to your question is, can they buy it? Of course they can. Would that potentially have legal issues with various agencies? We've seen that it could, and we've seen certain agencies are more likely to be kind of aggressive in preventing some of the consolidation in the industry. But we also saw them get rebuffed by the actual application of the laws and precedent surrounding them. So can they? Yes, they could. Will they? I don't think so. I don't think they're in the buying mood right now. They still have to get their ducks in a row as to how to operate their 34 game developers at this point in time. So I don't think they need a bunch more. And Ubisoft, as we will talk about, is an absolutely gigantic operation as it stands right this second. Marcius Nasty says, Anno series, Silent Hunter series. Anno is so good. Anno, for those of you that don't know, is essentially a city builder game that takes place in different years throughout history, with the years always adding up to the number 9 for some reason that I don't know. But the Anno series is perhaps my favorite city building series because it has multiple resource infrastructure. So you have to delicately balance your economy on kind of the edge of a knife and then say, all right, well, we're going to need coffee in order to entertain these people, in order to make the proper wool, in order to clothe these other people. And I have to expand my economy in such a way that I have to risk having the whole thing topple over because now there's too many people in this town and not enough in this town, and we don't have enough milk for the first people, and now the whole thing falls apart. And if that sounds interesting to you, congratulations, you can hang out with me. But also it is a wonderful game because the graphics are fun and you get to kind of cultivate this garden of growing in a 19th century or 15th century or whatever century organization, civilization that you have. And the newest Anno that they just announced, which is coming out, I think it's framed for next year, which may or may not actually happen. I always say that those release dates are subject to change, is Ancient Rome. So if you love that, get excited. Silent Hunter, I believe, is about submarine combat. I don't actually know that series as well, Marcius, so I'm sorry about that. But Anno is a great call. Thank you for bringing it up. Chris says the drama over Shadows is so overdramatic, it's not funny. Yeah, Shadows is the new Assassin's Creed, and the drama, such as it is about the fact that in this particular series, you're generally playing as someone from the culture that you're going into, right? So in ancient Egypt, you're playing as an Egyptian. In Renaissance Italy, you're playing as an Italian. And in this particular game that was coming out next month, has been pushed back to next February, you are playing as a black samurai as well as a Japanese ninja in feudal Japan. And there was a certain amount of uproar regarding the fact that you weren't able to play as a Japanese samurai in this context. And certainly I think some of that can be attributed to bigotry. But as I talked about last week, I think some of these discussion points cannot just be dismissed as bigots or racists or whatever, and that there are legitimate talking points to be had about when people look at things that are elevated above storytelling or gameplay or what have you and say, well, I think since there are so many games out and since my time is limited and since money is tight right now and the economy is what it is, that I can look at some of those things as a proxy for what I think is likely to be a less than experience for me. And that may or may not be fair. Certainly reasonable minds can differ on that point. But I do think that just dismissing people saying, well, if you elevate a black samurai instead of a Japanese samurai, you did that for a reason, and that suggests a certain standpoint for what you're thinking about in making this game. And that might elevate certain aspects of your storytelling or political messaging above what I want out of my gameplay or what have you, which might sound, again, too nuanced or too kind of wishy-washy, but I just don't think that some of the discourse online about this particular issue is useful. And I do think that reasonable minds can differ even on these kinds of points. So I do think it's overdramatic, as you suggest, but also that it tends to go both ways on that particular point. Roketsu86 says, I'm one of the weirdos who like the present-day Desmond stuff in Assassin's Creed and now just the present-day kind of making a video game stuff. And yes, Assassin's Creed has a modern-day plotline that goes with its ancient world plotline in which, for the most part, you're playing at a compromised video game publisher making video games out of the past. And if that sounds too meta, it largely is. But it also isn't necessary for the storytelling or to understand the virtual tourism aspects of Assassin's Creed. But yes, Roketsu86 is staking out a piece of ground here that we don't see too often, which is they like the modern day stuff in Assassin's Creed. More power to you. Like what you like. Don't let anybody tell you different. Don't let me tell you different. Don't let anybody on Twitter or online tell you different. If you like it, continue to like it. Anybody that comes in and says, no, you don't, or you shouldn't like something is not helpful, is not adding to the discourse or the conversation in a reasonable way. Marcia says, wait, they can't buy them. Ubisoft holds those Activision Blizzard streaming rights that allowed Microsoft to get that acquisition through the UK regulator. Marcius, you're jumping ahead. I promise I'm going to talk about that. I have the usual number of tabs ready to go. But yes, we're going to talk about the contract that Microsoft entered into with Ubisoft. I don't think that would prevent them from buying them. It would maybe make the CMA in United Kingdom pretty mad. It would maybe make the FTC pretty mad, but pretty mad doesn't actually stop deals from happening necessarily. So it doesn't mean they couldn't buy them. It would add a wrinkle certainly to the conversation. Sardism says, I think I'll play Frostpunk some more. The worst thing that happens there is everyone dies or I get thrown out to freeze to death. Frostpunk is a version of the city building RPG. It's a similar kind of game to Anno, but Frostpunk takes on some of the RPG elements and heightens them, gives you story elements to go along with those things. I like Frostpunk a lot. I have downloaded Frostpunk 2. I have not played it yet. So, yeah. Don says, Hoeg sounds a lot like Ara History Untold, the minutia of resources. It might be. I haven't gotten a chance to try Ara yet. And that's on me. That's my fault. Running a law firm, making video content for you all. Haven't gotten to play all the video games I've wanted to. But I do mean to check out Ara at some point in time. Against the Tide says, is the sound being weird every once in a while for anyone else? Let me know if it is. I really enjoyed the show last week. I enjoyed the conversation. I thought it was a good episode, but I did find out after the fact that my sound got screwed up somehow, and I don't know why. So if there is an issue with sound, let me know. It's not as obvious to me when I make a video, and I need your help in chat to let me know of those things. So please do if it is. Lucius Augustus, thank you so much for the super chat. And again, I really appreciate the super chats and all the support members and super chatters give to this channel. Please don't feel like it's necessary, but it is certainly appreciated. In Black Flag, you play as a Welshman in the Caribbean. People weren't crying about that then. In Neo 2, you play as a white samurai. No crying then. Well, Neo we can't attribute to Ubisoft. I know you're just making the point in general about the crying, but in Neo, that's not a Ubisoft game. And much like the Yasuke kind of move in Assassin's Creed Shadows, I believe in Neo you're playing as a real person. Black Flag, I don't believe that you are. But yes, it's a little bit unclear who would be the proper representation of piracy in the Caribbean at that point in time. I would argue that if you make them native to that geographic area, that you probably aren't being as truthful about who the people were that were committing piracy and engaged in those things in the Caribbean at that time. So you kind of got these various issues you got to work through if you're making a game in a historical context one way or the other. So I get your point. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that everybody is fair about their commentary culture war wise or these various things. And there certainly is a certain amount of bigotry or racism that goes along with these topics. I just don't think we can dismiss it solely because the dregs of the earth are on one side or the other. You don't just take a reasoned position and say it's gone because the bad people are on that side as well. Britt Cormier says, first and foremost, games should entertain. They should not try to be political or preachy first. When you try to push politics, you cut out half your audience. I tend to agree with this. You've heard me say on this channel about the difference between politics and politics, that I think people are more willing to adapt to, hey, tell me a story. And if you have certain political things that you want to present within that world as part of storytelling, as part of character arcs, as part of growth or plot, then I can accept that, even if I wouldn't necessarily agree with you on a kind of conceptual or thematic basis in a college seminar setting. But when you elevate that above the story and you say, here, I want to talk to you about the Middle East, or I want to talk to you about racism in the United States in the 21st century, I want to talk to you about these various things, I do think that takes away from the storytelling. And it's often at the expense of what should be organic storytelling. And that does happen in video games. It happens in movies. It happens in television. And so I do think that people that look at that and say, hey, I've experienced that in these media, and so when I see that in marketing, or I think I see that, I'm going to react to that as a proxy for not having a great experience, not having a great story, not enjoying myself as much as I think I should. Well, then I think a reasonable person can come to that conclusion and not just be thrown under the bigot or racism bus online. But again, I'm trying to operate a very specific kind of nuanced channel here on the internet that has these conversations from a reasonable minds may differ perspective, and not everybody is willing to listen to that message, certainly not early on. So Britt, thank you so much for your contribution. I think it's a good one. Roketsu86 says, clarification, I liked the Desmond stuff. The modern day stuff with current Assassin's Creed is just spinning its wheels in a boring way. That's a good clarification. The first three Assassin's Creeds had a kind of plot line to go with the Mayan end of times calendar ending in 2012. And just like that calendar, that plot line kind of ended in 2012. And then Ubisoft has a modern day plot line and they don't quite know what to do with it. So they have a meta discussion of making video games in historical settings. So that's fair, Roketsu. I didn't mean to put words in your mouth, certainly. Don, Hoeg, did my review scare you away? My first review for Seasoned Gaming. Which was your first review, Don? Was that Valhalla? I don't honestly know. I'm sorry. Did my review scare you away? It's a good question, but I don't know what review you're talking about. So in answer to your question, Don, I don't know. Maybe it did. But thank you. Nishay Jones, recommendations for things to play on the Switch. I have so many recommendations for things to play on the Switch. Well, first, Super Mario Party Jamboree comes out tomorrow. If you like the Mario Party games, my girls in Hoeg House are really excited about that game coming out tomorrow. So that'll be available. Certainly the new Zelda, Echoes of Wisdom, is a fantastic game, and I've really been enjoying that. I've also been playing an indie game called Last Time I Saw You, which I really like, that you'll probably hear me talk about on the Bitcast. And all of those play really well on the Switch. So check them out. Marcius Nasty says, Anno is less humor than Tropico, but same type of game. Broadly, city builders are the same, and Anno is a similar type of game to Tropico. Obviously, they all have differences. Anno is also built around kind of organizing your streets in a specific way so that everybody can get access to things like community buildings and various resource availability. So it's similar in spirit to the old Pharaoh and Zeus games, in my opinion. Now, those also have differences. They have worker distances that they go to and things that aren't in the Anno games. But without getting too deep into the weeds on game design, anything that is a city builder is going to be roughly a similar feel to a game like Anno. Sardinism says here, I think the real point of what I was saying, you get a big enough group of people together, it doesn't matter what the connection is, some of them are going to suck. And I think that's true. And I think that is unfortunately used in a lot of internet arguments, maybe real world arguments, to essentially tar whatever the other side of the matter that we're talking about is with the worst possible brush. Oh, look at the bad people on your side. And not as often looking at the bad people on my side because they don't represent me, but look at the bad people on your side. You connect with utter fools and whatnot. And I do think that there is a notion of kind of guilt by association. And we can talk about that with respect to Last Stand Media as well, because I've certainly been tarred with certain brushes in certain corners of the internet because I contribute to Last Stand. And I don't think that's fair, obviously, but other people do. I think it's a bad way to kind of discuss your points. I think putting people in groups and then associating them with whatever the worst of that group is not the way that reasonable minds can differ. But again, I'm pretty specific on this point. So, Roketsu Ubisoft Deep Cut, they published Buck Bumble on the N64. Now, that's a game name I haven't heard in decades. So, there you go. Buck Bumble, everybody. Published by Ubisoft. Emily Aarons, member for 24 months. 2 years. Happy to be part of your community, even if I'm totally lost when you talk about video games. Well, thank you for being here on this video game-centric Hangouts and Headlines then, Emily. And thank you for being here this whole 2 years. Honestly, I cannot do it without the support of all of you here. So thank you. Sardinisms. Hoeg's playing an indie game. Shocked gasp. Yeah, I play a lot of indie games. I think that oftentimes some of the best design, or at least the most experimental design, is coming from that space. And yes, a lot of that gets adopted into the AAA landscape for video games, but I like to experience those early on. And indie gaming is really fantastic this year and for the last few years. Shadow says, I've played all the AC games except for Mirage, and I have played and beat all the Far Cry games. So those are good choices. I like the Far Cry games a lot as well. Those were really some of the first-person open world experiences that I really remember enjoying a lot. There was an old game that I played back on the Atari ST called Midwinter that really made me aware of the possibilities of an open world landscape. I remember you could get like various snowmobiles and crafts to get around an island and ultimately try to defeat a bad guy on that island. And Far Cry 3, when it came out, reminded me of that. So if you love Far Cry, I like those games a lot. Some are better than others, just like any series of video games or movies or what have you. But absolutely, Far Cry, Assassin's Creed. I enjoyed Mirage. Actually, Mirage is going to come up as part of the conversation of this article that we're going to get to right now after we thank Sandy for gifting 10 Hoeg Law memberships. Thank you, Sandy. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the support. And thank you, everybody that became a member because of Sandy's generosity. So thank you so much. And we have another dog profile photo. So dogs and cats, roughly equal at this point, living together, pure anarchy. What are you going to do? And we can also talk now about our headlines. So with that said, let's do that. Before we do, let's mention that we do get supported by folks giving donations, giving support through Player, through Patreon, as well as the super chats and memberships that you've already seen discussed on this channel. So please do support if you're willing to do that, if you're available to do that, but don't feel obligated. I certainly don't want to send anybody to the poorhouse to help support a YouTube channel. But if you can, it's certainly appreciated. And thank you so much for doing so. With that said, let's talk about some headlines. So this is a headline that I wanted to talk to you about because it jumped out at me as I was researching a topic for, as Don properly called me out on, a video I was going to do for Sacred Symbols Plus at Last Stand Media, which should be going live today or tomorrow, very soon, either way. If you're interested in that, we'll talk about that towards the end of this video. But this article, I thought, did a really good job about discussing this particular topic. And I don't get to say that all the time in Hangouts and Headlines, right? I don't get to say, I think this article did a good job. And I want to point that out when it happens. I also want to point out that even though I think this article did a really good job, there are still areas where I think it gets a little bit beyond its own expertise. And we can talk about those, and we can talk about the fact that not any one person is going to have a level of expertise in every topic that even comes up in a single article. And so just like I recommend that if you like the topics we discuss here, that you go and check out other voices, other articles, other content creators online for any of the topics we discuss, I also recommend looking at a bunch of different article sources, because there are going to be things that are better at one place than another, even when everybody's trying to be non-biased, right? We are not talking about a topic here where they're trying to convince you to vote a certain way in an election or feel a certain way about a political topic. This is really just a business article about buyouts and things that I fortunately have experience with, but also in the video game industry. So we'll see that various places have a little bit more of a finger on the pulse on various aspects of this story. So Fast Company asks, what in the world is going on at Ubisoft, which I think is a great headline because it encourages you to find out. The video game publisher is once again the subject of buyout speculation. Where did things go wrong? And the reason I think this article is so well done is because it starts not with just that topic and hitting you with what's happening right now, but starts with background materials that I don't often see on the video game side of things, on the video game media side of things, which isn't to take away from them. They're really focused more on the video games themselves than the business of it all. But this is one aspect of looking at other places online that can help you understand things better, which is that Fast Company isn't focused on video games. It's focused on, as they say in their About Us, business media, written for and about the most progressive business leaders. Now, I believe they're using the term progressive there to mean essentially interested in progress, interested in speed and change, right? Fast Company. It might be more of a political statement. It doesn't appear that way to me. Fast Company inspires readers to think expansively, lead with purpose, embrace change, and shape the future of business. So just by reading this, we're helping shape the future of business, everybody. Don't you feel business-oriented? Feel good about our contributions? I hope so. Launched in November 1995 by Alan Weber and Bill Taylor, Fast Company set out to chronicle how changing companies create and compete, to highlight new business practices, and to showcase the teams and individuals who are inventing the future and reinventing business. Now, if you can stomach a lot of the corporatese and marketing terms in an About Us page, I do think they are useful for understanding what perspective a given website, a given outlet has when they make these stories. And so I do recommend to folks that they check out these kinds of things when they are looking at stories like this one, because you can understand now that this isn't an outlet that talks specifically about video games. It's an outlet that talks about companies, and more specifically about business operations within companies. So we're probably going to get a more fulsome approach to the business questions that we might be interested in with respect to a Ubisoft buyout, rather than the actual Ubisoft product line. And I counter position this to IGN, which is a company that I like more than some online, right? And I certainly regularly make videos with a IGN major contributor and Travis Northrup over at the Bitcast on Sundays. And so I don't have any negative feelings towards IGN on the whole. But when IGN talks about this particular issue, they tend to treat it more superficially than an article like the one we're going to read here. So you see their description of this. Ubisoft is having a rough go of it as of late. Star Wars Outlaws was not the big sales hit they expected. The next mainline Assassin's Creed game has been delayed to 2025. And their Call of Duty competitor, X-Defiant, has failed to catch on, probably because of its terrible title. Co-founder Yves Guillemot and Ubisoft's partners at Tencent are reportedly considered taking the company private to help stabilize their financials. And this is not a full article, obviously. This is just the summary they use for their kind of video news hit. So I don't want to throw them under any buses, but you can see it's a different approach, a different focus than what we're going to talk about as part of this article from Fast Company. So as background, they say in 2004, Electronic Arts made a run at the video game publisher, but was ultimately rebuffed. In 2015, Vivendi made an even more serious attempt that took years to defuse. Now, Ubisoft is the subject of speculation once again. Only this time, the deal could actually happen. Now, it's always easy to say that the things in the past that didn't happen didn't have a chance of happening. I think that this last sentence probably goes a little bit too far. This subject of speculation now has a deal that could potentially happen. In 2004, it could have potentially happened. In 2015, it most certainly could have happened. It almost did happen that Vivendi made a hostile takeover bid to purchase Ubisoft. And just to back up a step to talk about business and finances from my perspective as a corporate lawyer, you have to understand that a public company is a public company because the equity interest, the stock in the company, the actual ownership of the company is made available to the public for purchase. And then on secondary markets, the public is able to trade that interest in the company amongst themselves, right? When you look at the stock market, it isn't, generally speaking, primary issuances of stock from the companies. It's usually secondary transactions. It's transactions from somebody that owns shares in a company, selling it to someone else that wants to own those shares in the company. That's how the money moves up and down. The price moves up and down. And so if you are publicly traded, you always have a certain amount of exposure risk to somebody just saying, okay, well, I'm going to gobble up all the stock. And now I'm going to control your board of directors, and I'm going to change your board of directors. Then I'm going to gobble up the rest of your stock if I didn't get it all in the first bite. And so you're always at risk of a takeover, whether that's a friendly takeover where the board agrees that you would be a better owner of the company, or a hostile takeover where the board definitely does not agree. And so Ubisoft has found itself in this position. Why? Well, from a financial analyst perspective, and we'll see this covered in this article, it's because certain people, investors, folks with money, think that maybe the assets that are in the bucket of the fictional legal enterprise that is Ubisoft are not being utilized to their maximal extent, right? That they aren't making as much money as they could. And when the markets see that as an issue, they say, okay, then the stock is undervalued. I'll buy up that stock and flip that house like we were talking about earlier. But it's a good starting point for an article that they start with the fact that Ubisoft has had this happen before. The past few years have been far from the best for Ubisoft, and 2024 has been especially painful. The highly anticipated Star Wars Outlaws was a sales disappointment, and the company delayed the next entry in its Assassin's Creed franchise, Shadows. We talked about that earlier, cutting fiscal guidance at the same time. Now there's talk that Ubisoft is considering a buyout that would take it private, with shareholders Tencent and the Guillemot family, including CEO Yves Guillemot, leading the charge. And I just want to make sure that we get the definitions right here, the phraseology right here. Taking it private would mean removing their stock from those public exchanges. It does not mean that only Yves Guillemot or the Guillemot holding company would own the company. It doesn't mean that you'd have a limited number of investors. There are limits on the top number of investors for various tax reasons, but it doesn't mean that there's only one owner, right? We call that a solely owned enterprise or a wholly owned enterprise if it's owned by another parent company. But going private doesn't mean that you only have one owner. So it can be Tencent, it can be Tencent and the Guillemot family acting together. It can be another entire party that comes in and buys up everything and says, we're no longer going to sell these pieces of our company on the public exchange. And the reason that matters from an informational standpoint is that you're only allowed to sell publicly. You're only allowed to have a secondary market and to have these shares available on these exchanges if you agree in various jurisdictions to certain disclosures, right? The reason public companies or being a public company are expensive operations in the United States is because the Securities and Exchange Act requires you to say certain things about your company at certain times. And it's a big legal process that costs a lot of money and offers up exposure risk for the management and operators of the company. And taking it private would have you removed from that entire process, but it would also mean we would lose transparency as to how the company was actually operating on a profits basis and how revenue was moving around, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think about this with something that you're probably more connected with, it's like the difference between the Nielsen ratings for the networks and television, where we knew exactly how a show was rated, how many people were watching it, at least on a kind of scientific level or a statistical level. And now with the streaming infrastructure, where we have these companies that can kind of guess as to the minutes watched of shows, but we're not getting that information directly from the companies themselves. So it's a little bit different that way. But it is important to note that when they say they're going to be taken private or potentially taken private, it's the same thing as an outside party coming in. It's just right now an inside party talking about it, doing that kind of buyout. Ubisoft acknowledged the rumors in a statement on October 7th, stating that Ubisoft has noted recent press speculation regarding potential interests around the company. It regularly reviews all of its strategic options in the interest of its stakeholders and will inform the market if and when appropriate. Now, this is, again, in compliance with their fiduciary responsibilities as a public company, right? You don't want to commit a fraud on the market. You don't want to have secret information that your people could be moving the stock price around with. So you say, hey, look, we are not in discussions that are close enough to tell you about just yet. We are regularly reviewing all of our strategic options at all times, right? We're just doing business as normal, and we're evaluating those things. But the real politic of this is that when we look at things like the Ubisoft stock price and we look at the last month, we see this big dip when they announced their financials, when they announced essentially that Star Wars didn't do as well as they'd hoped and that they were moving Assassin's Creed. We see the dip because the market is reacting to the projection of what they think Ubisoft is going to be worth. And then we see some of this stuff filter out. Oh, they might be going private. And we see this big bump up in stock price. Why do we see that? Because imagine that you are interested in making a lot of money quickly on a stock. You might go and try to purchase things that are likely to be purchased by another party in the future, because anytime they would need to purchase enough of the company to control it, they would need to offer a premium on the price of the stock, such that if they were buying it here at $10.40, they'd probably need to offer $12 or $13 or something along those lines. It really depends on what the market will bear on those kinds of things. And so once that is in fact the case, you have more buyers on those rumors, and the price goes up to $14.28 before kind of settling. Why does it settle? Because Ubisoft makes the statement we just discussed that says, hey, we're not undergoing anything anytime soon. And so October 7th is the important date there. And we can see that actually highlighted here with the October 7th being when the price gets bumped up and then kind of flattens. Because Ubisoft says, hey, not so fast, everybody. We're not jumping on this thing. Why is that important for a private story? It's important because if the Guillemot family and Tencent are considering buying the company, then they don't want the stock price to go up. And this presents a certain conflict of interest because the Guillemots are also the management and have control of the board of the company. But they don't want the price to go up because if they're going to purchase it, they don't want to have to pay a premium on a higher price. So this is all sorts of things that you have to think about when you're making these kinds of comments. And I'm not accusing Ubisoft of anything untoward here. This is just the nature of making these kinds of disclosures. And the market will weigh those kinds of incentives when it's determining whether Ubisoft is telling the whole story here. Fast Company continues by saying talk of a Ubisoft takeover started floating long before the guidance was lowered, though. Rumors have been swirling as far back as May. Back then, the company was 30% off of its 52-week high and trading for less than half of what it did in July of 2018. Yeah, I'm just pointing out a month here, but if you look at the whole year, this is not the way you want your line to go. Right, we've got them at $29 last year on October 16th. Year over year now, they're down 54% is described here. And in the 5-year, they're down 76%, right? And this is exactly the kind of time when, as a public company, you have investors that start shaking their sabers, rattling their sabers and saying, hey, something is going wrong with the way that this management is treating our assets, is treating the assets that they control, and we should start thinking about a change in management. Now, because this is a family-owned company or family-controlled company in large part, that creates a more fractious conversation. It creates more issues. But we see even as part of that happened in the last 5 years, that certain investors were getting antsy and they started rattling their sabers. So just before this time period that we're talking about in September, late September of this year, you had stories in places like Reuters saying Ubisoft activist investor says it has support of 10% of shareholders in management tussle. And what happened here? AJ Investments, which has less than 1% of a stake in Ubisoft, said it was in talks with private equity firms for its push. We call on the management of Ubisoft to allow the sale of the company to third parties or private equity firms at a fair price. Now, interesting about this quote is that that's already their legal obligation, right? We talk about this. We talk about fiduciary duty in Virtual Legality and on this channel all the time. A board of directors and the management of a company is controlling and using money that is not theirs. It is money given to them as fiduciaries to go and use it to make more money, to make a company that can sell products or services and make that money grow. And so they can't just make decisions that are only for their benefit. And so when these laws are in play in these various jurisdictions, and Ubisoft is not an American company, they're a French company. So it's French law that we're talking about. And I'm not a French lawyer, but these precepts are shared across these various jurisdictions. Then if they are presented with somebody offering a legitimate offer for the company at a fair price, they are supposed to accede to that essentially and let it be to the shareholders to decide whether or not they want to sell to the company. Now, maybe this particular activist investor is concerned that they would breach their fiduciary duty. That's a whole different ball of wax. That would be a lawsuit in and of itself. But this is the kind of thing that happens when your share price takes a tumble for 5 years and then 1 year and all these various timeframes where it looks like you're not maximizing the value of your assets. AJ Investments did not name the investors in its letter, so it's just saying we have a 10% syndicate ready to go, but they are not telling anybody who might represent that 10%. The move comes weeks after AJ Investments called for a CEO change at Ubisoft and urged it to go private or be sold. And to some extent, this story isn't that exciting because this is a minority investor in a company saying we would prefer it if our shares were worth more, right? When there are legitimate rumors about a buyout, when there's legitimate pressure for a company to sell, then that share price, as we just looked at, goes up, right? We can see that even over the last month. When these rumors happen, the share price goes up. The minority shareholders that are currently holding these shares would rather have the share price be valued at 14.18 than 9.10. That's not really a surprise to anybody. And so when they do these kinds of things, they're trying to establish that they'd like to sell out. They'd like to become liquid. They'd like cash instead of these shares. They don't trust management. You guys should consider getting some kind of buyout happening because we want to get out. We can't really do it at a price we think is fair. Now, this article from Reuters also highlights that Ubisoft has not tracked with Take-Two and Electronic Arts. They fell during the pandemic. And then where the other ones bounced up in 2023 and on, they just kept falling in terms of stock price and share valuation. Now, part of that, and I didn't see this really covered in many of the stories, but what we did see in the financials of Ubisoft is that they were pressing for Q4 2024 to really be their bounce back. They were waiting. They were holding on to Star Wars. They were holding on to Assassin's Creed longer than maybe Electronic Arts and Take-Two were with some of the stuff that they sold. Electronic Arts and Take-Two also have sports properties. They have kind of evergreen properties that they can sell that Ubisoft really doesn't match. They don't have, even with something like The Crew, the same kind of bounce that Electronic Arts and Take-Two can have with their NBA games or with their soccer games or with now college football for Electronic Arts and certainly Madden and NFL football. And so Ubisoft is a little bit more exposed to the vagaries of the market, and they don't have that annualized ability to just go and sell a Madden and have a certain amount of bounce back with just that product. And so that's a part of this story as well. And certainly it's part of a story that an activist investor could say, well, why don't you have a license for some important sport in the United States? That seems to buoy up these other companies. It seems like you are being poor in your duties as stewards of our money if you don't go and figure out a way to protect yourself in that fashion. But Reuters also said Ubisoft's newly released Star Wars Outlaws had a strong launch last month. Now, that story has changed somewhat since this article was posted in the end of September, but sales have slowed since then. Analysts have said the focus should be much more on existing intellectual property and leveraging the strengths they have. It's a risky time to make more than $100 million bets on new IP or licensed IP that hasn't proven itself as a game yet, said Carl Contis, co-founder of data analytics firm Video Game Insights. And if you're ever wondering in the video game market why so many game companies are sticking with their current intellectual property and not doing anything terribly exciting or interesting, part of that story is from folks like this analytics firm that say you shouldn't be making bets on those things because not enough people are interested in Star Wars right now, or not enough people have enough money to buy into these things, or maybe Ubisoft shouldn't have made a game in the fashion that they did with Star Wars Outlaws. Now, I talked about this last week. Star Wars Outlaws turned out, in my opinion, to be a very good game that had a very rough beginning, but we see Ubisoft kind of fixing that up after the fact now, after it launched a couple of months ago. And I certainly wouldn't recommend that. But this, again, is a company that was having a diving share price and had put all of its eggs in the end of 2024 basket. So when they moved Assassin's Creed and when Star Wars Outlaws was not the rip-roaring success that they had hoped it would be, this is the end result. And so I do think we get good discussions of these points from Fast Company, from Reuters. Ubisoft has a rich catalog of owned franchises, including Assassin's Creed, The Rabbids, Prince of Persia, and Watch Dogs, as well as locked-in licensing deals. Tom Clancy, Uno, South Park. Those have historically made it appealing to suitors, but the company's troubles have cast a shadow. Yeah, they didn't make money on that Star Wars game, or at least it seems that they didn't. Players lambasted Outlaws, calling the combat repetitive and noting the stealth mechanics needed more polish and were too similar to Assassin's Creed. And I highlighted this because this is one area where I did want to point out that I think this article is very good. I think the Reuters article is very good at talking about the business aspects of this, but they don't really understand the fundamentals of the product or service line that this company is putting out there. Star Wars Outlaws is not having issues because it was too similar to Assassin's Creed. If anything, it didn't adopt as much of the modernization of Assassin's Creed as we've seen in even the last 3 Assassin's Creed titles. If you play Mirage next to Outlaws, the Mirage stealth gameplay is so much more advanced and so much more appealing than what Outlaws presents at the very start of its game that you can't help but think that it should have benefited more from being the studio that made Assassin's Creed. It's not that it was too similar. The combat being repetitive is perhaps a legitimate complaint about the game. I didn't find it personally repetitive, but I'm a little bit more lenient on that kind of thing vis-a-vis gameplay in a story and world that I really like, and I really like the story and world of Outlaws. And the optional season pass model that tacked an additional $40 onto the game's price for additional missions was widely panned. And there's certainly people that are out there on the internet panning these kinds of things. It looks like more money, but part of this story would have to be that this is how Ubisoft has operated for many, many years. They sold a $60 game and a $100 package of that game and a couple of DLCs and season pass components. With every Assassin's Creed that I can think of, a lot of games that were not Assassin's Creed or Outlaws, things like the Immortals franchise that unfortunately became a single one-off game. So this cannot be the reason that Ubisoft is facing particular friction right now. And I think that if you were really familiar with the game industry or Ubisoft sales pattern in particular, this is not a sentence that you would include. So even in this article that I recommend, folks, they still have a section here that I think you probably get better information from the IGNs and the GameSpots of the world than you would in this particular article. So it does take more than one perspective to get a fulsome look at any given story. Michael Pachter of Wedbush cited that review bombing in a note to investors, writing, "This is a case of a rare incel victory that led to Ubisoft having to take down its numbers." I don't agree with this quote, but I did want to highlight it because it is a notion that goes on around these kinds of topics. Michael Pachter is a very well-known analyst that is quoted and makes videos on a lot of these same things that we discuss here in Virtual Legality or Hangouts and Headlines. And rare incel victory is probably not the description I would put on Ubisoft Assassin's Creed Shadows or Star Wars Outlaws. But it seems clear that Ubisoft has been chastened or concerned about Assassin's Creed Shadows. For some reason, I tend to chalk that up to the reaction to the Concord video game from Sony PlayStation, which is a major publisher. Obviously, they make the PlayStation hardware, and Concord had a big push behind it, had a state of play almost specifically around its release, and it came out, didn't succeed. And if you look online, part of that conversation was because of the various character designs, body types, descriptions of things within the game that I don't think actually wound up negating the gameplay itself of Concord. I enjoyed Concord quite a lot. But again, talking about the proxy situation, I do think you could look at that. You can look at the way that some of the designers operated online, talking to potential fans of that game, and say, I think they're more concerned about other things than presenting a good game, and take that as a proxy and say, I'm not interested in playing Concord or otherwise supporting it. And I think that Ubisoft reacts to a game company of that size having that amount of difficulty when we haven't seen that before and says, we got to move Assassin's Creed Shadows out. We potentially have to change things within Assassin's Creed Shadows, but we have to move it out of this particular time frame. And I don't view that as a rare incel victory. I'm not entirely clear why you'd call anything about this incel related, but internet discourse can sometimes get away from people, even professionals like Michael Pachter. Instead, Ubisoft reportedly took another route, contemplating its own buyout. The company clearly has value, and with the support of the Guillemot family and the investment of strategic investor Tencent, we think that a formal takeover bid has a chance of succeeding, Pachter wrote in a separate note to investors. And I agree, it definitely does have a separate chance of succeeding. Having the CEO and his family consider a buyout in partnership with Tencent might seem unusual if you don't know the Guillemots. And then this particular article writer talks about the fact that he's interviewed Yves Guillemot a number of times, and he's an unusual cat. 15 years ago, as Vivendi bought more shares and held more of the company's voting rights than the Guillemot family, he began hunting for partners. He ultimately found them in Tencent, the massive Chinese gaming company, and the Ontario Teachers' Pension, who paid just over $2 billion to Vivendi to buy out its shares. And one thing you'd hear about me hear me say on Last Stand Media a couple of Sacred Symbol Pluses ago is that, yeah, Yves Guillemot is a kind of a badass. He's a kind of Godfather type figure. He got attacked. His company got attacked by Vivendi. They were going to buy out his company, and he found the Ontario Teachers Pension to backstop a play to get those shares back and to prevent somebody from taking over his company. So he is the kind of guy that will go and build the moat around the company. And now he has in Tencent a financial strategic partner that has a ton of money to do this if he wants to do it. And because of that, because he controls the board, because he controls the company, and he can put out statements like the one we saw that say, hey, we're not doing anything strategic just yet, he can create a moat around the company that prevents hostile takeover bidders from necessarily dipping their toes in. Not because they don't want to, but because if it's going to be a hostile bid, if it's going to be this big, giant legal fight, then you have to have a high level of appetite for getting stuck in the court system, getting stuck in really, really controversial things. And a lot of people are just not going to want to do that when there's other potential investment possibilities out there. A private buyout would likely bring job cuts. I honestly think job cuts are happening at Ubisoft, however this goes. Ubisoft has 19,000 employees worldwide. And Pachter says based on current guidance, revenues work out to just 103,000 euros per employee. The company also needs to shake out how it makes games, something Guillemot himself acknowledged when announcing the lowered guidance. We acknowledge the need for greater efficiency while delighting players, he said. As a result, the executive committee, under the supervision of the board of directors, is launching a review aimed at further improving our execution, notably in this player-centric approach and accelerating our strategic path towards a higher performing model to the benefit of our stakeholders and shareholders. And stakeholders jumps out here because stakeholders are specifically not shareholders, right? There are other people that have an interest in the success of the company, but that concept is very vague. It's very generous in kind of approach. It can include everything from environmental regulations surrounding how we make our games in the various areas that we make them to the player base itself. And so when you see stakeholders here, you have to understand that this statement, which is again very corporatized, very marketing oriented, is designed to basically say we're going to do better at being player centric, but also we're going to take a strategic path, not just for our shareholders, but for everyone else that might be interested in the company. The bigger question, though, is will that be enough? Asks this particular article. Ubisoft has alienated a portion of its player base in recent years and needs to get them back. Reading online comments about the company might make it appear that's nigh-hand impossible to do. Honestly, I think if you take as sacrosanct online comments about virtually anything, you're going to find that everybody is negative about every topic that you could possibly imagine, that you think that nothing will ever occur in a positive light. I don't recommend that for anybody. I don't recommend taking just the internet as your sole source of understanding of what these things can do. But he doesn't finish with that thought. He finishes with, but if the video game industry has one truism, it's this. It only takes one really good game to make people forget vows of boycotts and past missteps, right? In baseball, momentum is just your next starting pitcher. In media, video games, movies, television, what have you, it's your next good product, right? If Ubisoft just knocks it out of the park, gets huge reviews from everyone is enjoying their next product. If Assassin's Creed Shadows turns out to be awesome, then none of this is really going to matter. One of the things that's happening as part of this story, in my opinion, is that Ubisoft is buying time. So Assassin's Creed got moved because they did kind of flinch at what is happening in the video game industry right now, what is happening across media in various respects, right? Joker 2 is part of this story. Concord is part of this story. All of these things that we see in a tightening economy and looking at leisure pursuits like video games and movies are suggestive of the fact that you just want to get out of this time frame if your game can even optically be considered something that values something other than entertainment for the people that would otherwise buy it. And even though I'm going to get Assassin's Creed Shadows because I'm pretty convinced that I will love it, not everybody of course, has to agree with me on that particular topic. So they move out of there and they say, I think Assassin's Creed Shadows is probably going to stabilize the view of the company. We've bet on the company for that for a number of years. So we still think that's going to happen in February. So we'll wait for that stabilization point, and then maybe this isn't as big of a topic. But in the meantime, the Ubisoft stock price continues to crater, and you can certainly understand why investors are potentially getting agitated. Now, as part of this story as well, I promised that I would talk about this particular question that has come up to me on Twitter and in my emails a number of times. So this is from Michael Askew, aka Skew. Hoeg, if Ubisoft ends up being purchased by Tencent by going from a publicly traded company to private, would that agreement be voided since Xbox made no agreement with them? And I think this kind of highlights an important understanding of what corporations are. When I say they're a legal fiction, I mean that they are entirely their own enterprise, separate from their ownership, and the law recognizes them as such, which we consider a fiction because Ubisoft is really just a pile of money that makes video games, just like any movie studio is a pile of money that makes movies, or any software company is a pile of money that makes software. And what he's talking about in respect of this specific question is, if you might remember, if you followed it with Virtual Legality with us here or otherwise, Ubisoft and Activision entered into a deal for the cloud rights, the streaming rights to the Activision library of games, including Call of Duty, because Microsoft was getting a lot of pushback that they could make Call of Duty their own product and that this would destroy the video game market, which on its face is not a terribly logical position. But the Federal Trade Commission in the US and the CMA in the UK wound up buying into this somewhat. And so they agreed as part of the solution that they were going to sell off the cloud streaming rights to Call of Duty and Activision Blizzard titles. Who did they wind up selling them off to? Ubisoft, which becomes a part of this story. And they say, okay, well, if the ownership changes, Rick, what happens to this contract? Ubisoft will now control where Call of Duty and other Activision Blizzard games show up on cloud gaming services, with the exception of EU countries and the various cloud gaming deals Microsoft signed previously. If you're outside of Europe, then it's up to Ubisoft which services get cloud streaming rights for Activision Blizzard games, including licensing these back to Microsoft to include in Xbox cloud gaming. Why Ubisoft? Well, a number of companies wanted the cloud gaming rights and had to essentially pitch the Competition and Markets Authority in the UK, the CMA. The interview-like process meant the CMA picked out the companies that would work best. Good pick, CMA, with its concerns over cloud gaming, and then it was up to Microsoft to ultimately decide on which company to restructure its deal with. Ubisoft had some money and they were inclined to do it. Microsoft doesn't have a direct competitive relationship with Ubisoft, so the deal is made. While the deal lasts for 15 years, the licenses are perpetual, so Ubisoft will still have the rights and still be able to provide games to people and companies worldwide, even after those 15 years pass by. And this is one of those areas that got confused when people were discussing this particular license. So they have a license to the products that come out within the 15-year window that this contract covers, but they have a license forever to those specific products. And we don't know the terms of that contract itself, but one thing that I mentioned as part of this answer, and I said it a couple of times on Twitter/X, the contract itself would control, right? The contract is with Ubisoft. Ubisoft remains. So the ownership is distinct from the company. And so even if the ownership changes, Ubisoft is still sitting there as a big pot of money and an invisible legal fiction. And even if the ownership changes, Ubisoft doesn't move on the board as we're thinking about these things. So Ubisoft stays, but a contract can protect from events like this. So here is a website from Skadden Arps, who helped write essentially a primer for lawyers as to how to best negotiate things like intellectual property licenses. And these are the kinds of things that lawyers have to read all the time, either for continuing legal education or just to be good at their jobs. And this one is from the Practical Law Company. I believe it's on Skadden's site because they helped write it. But this is about U.S. law relating to the transferability of agreements that contain intellectual property licenses. And I'm not going to bore you to tears and read this whole thing to you. This will, of course, be linked on the podcast page to this episode because we don't link directly on YouTube because it gets mad at me. But it says things like the default rules are that a contract that is silent on assignment is generally freely transferable. So if you don't ban assignment, if you are a contract party, you can generally assign your rights to another. But a lot of the contracts that you'll see, you can see this in terms of service and various other places online, or that you might relate to on a regular basis, will say this is not assignable except with the consent of the other party, things like that. The default rule of IP licenses, where an IP license is silent on assignability by the licensor can generally assign its rights subject to the same considerations as other contracts. But under federal rule, non-exclusive licenses cannot necessarily be transferred because they're essentially just an agreement not to sue for infringement. And so there's a lot of things that go on as part of this evaluation. But what I wanted to get you to is that the notion of copyrights being transferred can be protected against things like corporate transactions, right? So if you're changing the ownership of your company, what kind of transaction is that? You might think, well, if it's just ownership changing, you might not have these kinds of issues. You might not have an assignment at all. But one of the ways that companies get bought is in a type of transaction we call an asset sale, which is, again, if you think of this company as a bucket of assets, they have the licenses to Tom Clancy and Uno, they have these development companies, they have the furniture in their offices. Then instead of selling ownership, you have the capacity to sell the assets themselves, including the contracts. And in that particular context, that's very likely to be an assignment. And then we have to read the contracts to understand whether or not that's prohibited, whether you need to get consent, whatever else happens. In a stock sale, like the one we're talking about here, going private of a public company, or even a hostile takeover bid, the target company's shares or other equity interests of the buyer are moved without transferring any of the target company's assets. Because the target company remains the same legal entity following the transaction, a stock sale is typically not found to cause an assignment of the target company's license rights. And there can be other variations on this. This is the reason lawyers will only tell you it depends if you present a hypothetical to them, is because there's a lot of different things that can come into play here. But generally speaking, when ownership changes, the company is still just the same bucket. You don't have to move anything like that. And so if you're the CMA, if you're the FTC, if you're Microsoft, you might get concerned about assignment happening just by virtue of the change of control. And some laws, some statutes, some jurisdictions say a change of control is automatically an assignment by operation of law, which is language you might see in contracts as well. But more specifically, a contract will often have anti-assignment language you can't assign, or change of control provision, which I'm hopeful is going to come up here. A change of control position. A common misconception in drafting and interpreting contracts, including IP licenses, is that an anti-assignment clause covers a party's change in control. This is something that I actually remember talking about with my first-year associates in the law firm quite a bit. You say, okay, if you can't assign it, then we're covered, right? You can't assign it. But you do have to think about things like Tencent taking your company private. However, prohibitions on changes of control are likely not implied from a simple anti-assignment clause. So a change of control provision gives a party certain rights in connection with the other party's transaction. So you say, you can't assign this, including by operation of law or a change in control of your ownership, without our consent, or if you do, these bad things happen to the royalty terms or the license terms, etc. But what's important here is that a change of control is entirely a creature of contract. You define it in that contract what we mean by change of control. It can be a transfer of more than 50% of a party's voting stock. It can be a change in majority of the party's board members. It can be anything else that you describe in your contract. There are more ambiguous ways to say these things from a legal drafting perspective that say things like, if the spirit of control of the management of the company gets changed. And it probably wouldn't be that vague, but there are ways to say it where you say, well, look, if I think the company is operated differently, then I can take this contract back and that'll be viewed as an assignment, et cetera, et cetera. And this is part of negotiation. This is what I do for a living. And this 14-page document shows you the 100 things that you have to think about just with a simple IP license. So that's the practice of law for you. Nobody's perfect at it, including myself. But there's a lot of things to think about. And when we talk about Ubisoft, when we talk about this contract, it is unlikely that it would just be voided by Tencent taking control, or by the Guillemot family taking control, or by both of them taking control together. But we would have to know the language of the contract itself and what happens on a change of control. Does it just void if the assignment is attempted without the consent of somebody like Microsoft, the licensor? Does something else happen? Does the CMA get involved? Does the FTC have to get involved in these various things in the contract? It really depends on how it's written. We don't have that contract in front of us, so it's all speculative. But the short form answer to this, and a number of people asked, so I wanted to talk about it as part of this video, is that it wouldn't automatically just go back or revert to Microsoft. This doesn't just get unwound if Tencent and the Guillemots take Ubisoft public, at least as far as we can tell. So with that as our background, I did want to flag for people that if you enjoy this conversation about Ubisoft, if you enjoy hearing from me more often than just the videos I include on my channel, I am a regular contributor at Last Stand Media. I'm contributing to them now a couple of times a month pretty regularly. I've highlighted here the latest Constellation, which is the name for their discussion podcast series, where various people that are affiliated with Last Stand Media just talk about random stuff. You can see here from this picture that on this particular episode, we talked about our day jobs. So you have a little background lore that you may or may not know about me already. We talked about how we deal with anger, and we talked about whether or not there's a bifurcation of culture or a fractionalization of culture with the Hollywood Reporter's new article about the A-list of influencers, which is the topic that I brought to the discussion on Constellation. And if any of that interests you, you can check that out. And then later today, or a little bit later this week, there should be a Sacred Symbols Plus that will come up as part of their Patreon tier. It is paywalled, but I highly recommend it if you want to support the channel that helps support me and this content here. Checking it out. It will be a conversation between me, Gene Park of the Washington Post, and Colin Moriarty, the brains behind Last Stand Media, about Ubisoft, about various aspects of things like Assassin's Creed Shadows and the DEI call-outs and various aspects of the culture war that I think is a very good conversation. It goes a couple hours long.
And like I said, I'm in a few episodes per month now at this point on that channel. So please do check it out. And then I will leave you with catching up on membership comments and super chats, and then general comments about this topic. So if you have questions, if you think there's anything I didn't cover properly or that you'd like to have a little bit more clarity on, let me know, and I will try to grab these super chats and membership comments and then hit everything else as part of the end of this Hangouts and Headlines. Thank you so much to everybody who has joined us for this conversation. I hope it was helpful. If you do think it was helpful, share it along. If you're following on later, listening to this in podcast form or in replay on YouTube, thank you so much for joining us. Please leave a like. Please subscribe if you're interested in this material, or leave a comment. All of those things YouTube loves. It tickles them pink, helps get more people seeing this type of content in these conversations, which I hope are informative and more helpful than some of the other stuff that we regularly see so often online. So with that said, let's see if we can grab a few things that I have previously missed. So Don is pointing out, as we talked about earlier in the Hangouts portion, that his first review for Seasoned Gaming was Aura. I'm sorry about that, Don. I just didn't connect the dots there. That is my fault. But I should check out that review as well. Interestingly, on those kinds of games where I have them available on Game Pass and they're strategic in nature, I oftentimes skip reviews because I don't want to be, this sounds weird to say, but spoiled on the mechanics. I like to discover these things and say, oh, you're expanding this whole thing out into a card game, or, oh, you're doing this that I didn't expect. And so I oftentimes skip the reviews on topics like that. So I apologize for missing that one, Don. And then Crazy by Proxy, thank you for being a member for almost 2 years. Good morning, all. Coming in late, but better late than never. Absolutely, it is better late than never. And you can always watch what you missed in replay after this video gets done. So thank you for popping in for this Hangouts and Headlines. I hope even if you weren't interested in Ubisoft or French companies or buyouts or takeovers, that you got some information out of this particular topic, because I love talking about this stuff. I'm passionate about these things. So thank you so much for joining us today. Let's see if I can control these comments on my screen and make it a little bit easier to read half this stuff. Okay, so back to the comments. Space Shot says the CMA was just looking for a win and a pound of flesh to extract from Microsoft. I think that's a fair kind of description of certainly the end state of the CMA's attempt to block the deal to purchase Activision. And so I don't think that they're actually likely to care necessarily about what happens to Ubisoft as part of this conversation. But I also would have told you that they were unlikely to press some of the things that they pressed as part of the Activision acquisition in general. So you don't know what you don't know about a regulatory agency, and certainly you don't know about the politics behind the actions of that regulatory agency. So I think they were looking for a win, and if they feel chastened or slighted by Ubisoft trying to get out of this, or that a change of control provision would revert certain of the rights back to Microsoft, they might try to make a deal out of it. We know the FTC is proceeding with some of the things to try to unwind the deal, even though I think they are wildly unlikely to be successful on that score. But it is a fair comment, and I appreciate it. Secret Squirrel says if Ubisoft goes back to making games with 0% identity politics in them, then their next game would probably be a hit, because when you stop catering the minority and cater the majority, you win. Well, I think the Assassin's Creed series is one that Ubisoft has always kind of identified as, they had the disclaimer at the front of that game saying it's made by a bunch of different religious backgrounds, and then they added ethnicities and gender identities and various other things to that disclaimer. But I don't think they have to give up on what they want to make. I think they just have to highlight the storytelling and entertainment aspect of what they are making in front of whatever kind of modern day analogous political polemics you want to make. And this is not just a unique thing for Ubisoft. It's really for everybody that makes things that are designed to be entertaining, especially with a tightening economy, with people tightening up their belts, with less money going around and available for leisure pursuits. Space Shot, with the Ubisoft thing, the CMA wanted a remedy that I guess is more like a structural remedy, but they didn't seem to stop and think about if Ubisoft got gobbled up by another large publisher. Yeah, again, they couldn't win on what they were looking to win on. So this is a little bit like a structural remedy insofar as they had to divest a certain amount of their assets, in this case, the cloud streaming rights to the games they are otherwise making, which is an unusual remedy. And I don't know that it would have solved anything in the long term anyway. But I do think that's what the CMA was doing. So I agree there. Leo says Mirage probably meant to usher in an Infinity Hub, which was relegated to pre-delay shadows. Where's the connection to side scroller except for backsetting? With respect to Prince of Persia? Yeah, I think I caught the end of this conversation, but the Prince of Persia Lost Crown, I don't think has a direct connection with Assassin's Creed, but it does have some kind of game development similarities with some of the two-dimensional Assassin's Creed side-scroller games they had made in the past. So apologies for getting only the back half of that. Not too terribly smooth on my part, but that happens when you're doing things live. Thank you so much, Sandy, for even more Hoeg Law memberships being gifted. I really do appreciate it. That is so generous of you, Sandy. And thank you to everybody that has participated in this conversation and with the super chats and memberships and just been around to have this discussion with us. So thank you so much, Sandy, and to the whole community for this entire conversation. And I think we might well be done with comments at this point in time, unless I have missed some. And if I have, just flag it for me. Give me a Hoeg Law or a Q : or whatever else can help me see those kinds of things. But I really appreciate everyone being here. Do check out Last Stand Media if you're interested. They have very kind of low-priced Patreon support tiers, and I am on there a lot now at this point. If for some reason you don't get enough Hoeg, you can see me there quite often. And thank you so much for supporting me in that way and for supporting places like Last Stand Media that helps this channel survive and honestly exist in that same tightening economy that everybody else is facing. Certainly Hoeg Law and me, myself, and my family are as well. And as folks know, it's been a difficult year with healthcare expenses and everything else. We don't need to talk about that stuff. That's not the point of an hopefully entertaining video like this. But I just want you to know that I really sincerely appreciate all of the support and all of the help. So leave a like, subscribe if you're interested, check out Last Stand Media, leave a comment, and hopefully this was useful to you in understanding what's happening with Ubisoft. I really do want to call out places like Fast Company for doing a good job of reporting on these things, and places like IGN and GameSpot and the video game community as well for being better equipped to report on the video game side of the product service alignment as well, right? I'm giving Fast Company a lot of credit for talking about the business side. IGN and GameSpot, they get a lot of crap online. They get a lot of crap from all corners. They generally do a pretty good job of talking about video games, even if sometimes they also bring some of their agendas and items into the discussion when I would prefer to not have those things. So that all said, thank you so much for being here in Hangouts and Headlines, and I will catch you on the next episode, either of Hangouts and Headlines, Virtual Legality, Bitcast, or if you find me over at Last Stand Media. Thank you in any way that I wind up seeing you again.
Virtual Legality is a YouTube video series with audio podcast versions presented as commentary and for education and entertainment purposes only. It does not constitute legal advice and does not create an attorney-client relationship. If you have legal questions about the topics discussed, please consult your own legal counsel.